The collapse of Imperial Japan in August 1945 marked the beginning of one of history's most dramatic reckonings with wartime leadership. As Allied forces systematically hunted down and prosecuted those responsible for some of the most heinous atrocities of World War II. What followed was a cascade of arrests, trials, suicides, and executions that decimated Japan's military and political elite, forever changing the nation's power structure. The manhunt begins. Within days of Japan's surrender on September 2, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, ordered the arrest of 39 suspected war criminals, targeting primarily members of Hideki Tojo's wartime cabinet. The occupation forces moved swiftly, understanding that delay might allow key figures to escape justice or destroy evidence of their crimes. The most dramatic arrest occurred on September 11, 1945, when American soldiers surrounded the suburban Tokyo home of former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. As the 5 American GIs approached to serve the arrest warrant, Tojo retreated to his study and pressed a .32 caliber pistol to his chest, attempting to follow the samurai tradition of honorable death rather than face the humiliation of trial. The bullet missed his heart, and as he lay bleeding, Tojo gasped out what he believed would be his final words. "I wanted to die by the sword, but the pistol had to do. I assumed the responsibility for the war. Banzai." American medics rushed to save Tojo's life, transfusing American blood into the man who had orchestrated the Pearl Harbor attack. His survival was both ironic and essential. The Allies needed him alive to stand trial and face justice for his crimes. During his recovery at the U.S. Army's 98th Evacuation Hospital in Yokohama, Tojo reportedly received new dentures from an American dentist who secretly engraved "Remember Pearl Harbor" in Morse code into the dental work. Though this message was later removed, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, established in January 1946, became the venue for prosecuting Japan's most senior war criminals. Unlike the Nuremberg trials in Germany, the Tokyo Tribunal faced unique challenges in establishing legal precedent for trying leaders of an Asian imperial power. The prosecution had to prove 3 critical elements: that war crimes were systematic or widespread, that the accused knew troops were committing atrocities, and that the accused had the power to stop these crimes. 28 major war criminals faced charges, though the proceedings were marked by controversy from the start. 2 defendants, Yosuke Matsuoka and Osami Nagano, died of natural causes during the lengthy trial, while Shumei Okawa was declared mentally unfit and removed from proceedings. The remaining defendants faced charges of crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity, encompassing everything from the planning of aggressive war to the systematic brutalization of prisoners and civilians. The trial proceedings revealed the depth of Japan's systematic brutality across its empire. Evidence presented included testimonies about the Nanjing massacre, where Japanese forces murdered hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war. The tribunal heard harrowing accounts of biological warfare experiments, forced labor camps, and the systematic starvation and torture of Allied prisoners. Each revelation further cemented the case against Japan's wartime leadership, making their eventual punishment inevitable. The brutal executions at Sugamo Prison on November 12, 1948. After nearly 3 years of proceedings, the tribunal delivered its verdicts. 7 men were sentenced to death by hanging, their fates sealed by the overwhelming evidence of their roles in Japan's wartime atrocities. The condemned included General Hideki Tojo, the architect of Japan's war strategy; General Kenji Doihara, Chief of Intelligence Services in Manchuria; Koki Hirota, the former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister; General Seishiro Itagaki, the War Minister; General Heitaro Kimura, Commander of Burma Area Army; Lieutenant General Akira Muto, Chief of Staff of the 14th Area Army; and General Iwane Matsui, Commander of Forces responsible for the Nanjing Massacre. The executions took place in the early morning hours of December 23, 1948, at Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. MacArthur, fearful of antagonizing the Japanese population, banned all photography and media coverage, allowing only 4 members of the Allied Control Council to serve as official witnesses. The secrecy surrounding the executions was so complete that even today, The identities of the executioners remain classified in blacked-out documents. New gallows were specially constructed for the occasion, and the condemned men were led from their cells to a Buddhist chapel for final prayers before being escorted to the execution chamber. Each man was flanked by 2 armed American guards as they walked through the prison courtyard for the last time. Tojo was identified by witnesses as he turned to face them, walking the 13 steps to the gallows platform with a black hood over his head. Within 90 seconds of entering the death chamber, all 7 men had been executed. Their bodies were immediately cremated to prevent the creation of martyrs' shrines, and their families were denied the ashes. The fate of field commanders, while the Tokyo Tribunal dealt with Japan's political and military leadership, other Japanese commanders faced swift justice in the territories where they had committed their crimes. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya who had conquered Singapore in a brilliant campaign, met his end in the Philippines, where his forces had committed horrific atrocities. Yamashita's trial opened on October 29, 1945, focusing on 3 categories of war crimes committed by troops under his command. The most devastating charges concerned the rampage in Manila during February 1945, when approximately 20,000 Japanese naval forces placed under Yamashita's tactical command went berserk, raping and pillaging civilians as American forces closed in. Although Yamashita had twice ordered these forces to abandon the city, the naval commander ignored these orders and chose to fight to the death, resulting in the destruction of central Manila and the deaths of countless civilians. The trial established the controversial principle of command responsibility, holding Yamashita accountable for crimes committed by subordinates, even when he had no direct knowledge or control over their actions. This legal precedent would influence military law for decades to come, making commanders liable for the actions of their troops, regardless of their personal involvement. On February 23, 1946, at 3:02 a.m., Yamashita was hanged as a war criminal on Luzon Island and buried in a Japanese cemetery at Los Banos prisoner of war camp. General Masaharu Homma, commander of the Japanese 14th Army that had conquered the Philippines, faced trial for the infamous Bataan Death March. Homma was charged with 48 counts of violating international rules of war related to the systematic abuse and murder of Allied prisoners during the forced march. The prosecution presented horrific testimony from survivors, including accounts of Japanese soldiers bayoneting prisoners who fell behind and denying food and water to the starving captives. During his defense, Homma claimed ignorance of the atrocities, stating he was preoccupied with planning the assault on Corregidor and had delegated prisoner handling to subordinates. However, his headquarters were located only 500 feet from the route of the death march, making his claims of ignorance difficult to believe. On February 11, 1946, Homma was convicted on all counts and sentenced to be shot to death with musketry, considered more honorable than hanging. He was executed by American firing squad on April 3, 1946 in Los Banos. Laguna, the emperor's controversial immunity. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Japan's post-war reckoning was the fate of Emperor Hirohito, who remained on his throne despite widespread calls for his prosecution. Australia, Britain, and 70% of the American public wanted Hirohito tried as a Class A war criminal. However, General MacArthur opposed this course of action, believing that a cooperating emperor would be essential for maintaining order during the occupation. MacArthur's decision was based on pragmatic rather than moral considerations. He feared that prosecuting the emperor, whom many Japanese still considered divine, could trigger widespread civil unrest and make the occupation impossible. Instead, MacArthur crafted a strategy that separated Hirohito from the militarists, retained him as a constitutional monarch, but stripped of real power, and used his cooperation to achieve American post-war objectives in Japan. This immunity came at a terrible cost to historical justice. Evidence that might have incriminated Hirohito and the imperial family was systematically excluded from the Tokyo Tribunal, ensuring that the emperor's role in Japan's aggressive wars and war crimes would never be fully examined in a court of law. Even members of the imperial family, including Prince Mikasa, Hirohito's youngest brother, urged him to abdicate and accept responsibility for Japan's defeat, but the emperor refused. The Unit 731 cover-up one of the most disturbing aspects of the post-war period was the American decision to grant immunity to the scientists and doctors of Unit 731, Japan's biological warfare research facility. Led by Dr. Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 had conducted horrific medical experiments on thousands of Chinese, Mongolian and Allied prisoners, including vivisection without anesthesia, deliberate infection with deadly diseases, and freezing experiments. When Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders arrived in Japan in September 1945 to investigate biological warfare activities, he initially knew nothing about Unit 731. However, after threatening to involve the Soviets in the investigation, Japanese officials provided him with a manuscript describing their biological warfare program. Sanders took this information to General MacArthur, who made a calculated decision that would haunt history. MacArthur struck a secret deal with Japanese informants, granting immunity to Ishii and his team in exchange for exclusive American access to their research data. The Americans feared that the Soviets, who had captured some Unit 731 personnel, would gain a strategic advantage in biological weapons development. This Cold War calculation meant that some of history's worst war criminals escaped justice entirely, their crimes covered up by the very nation they had fought against. Lesser war criminals and regional justice, beyond the high-profile Tokyo trials, thousands of other Japanese war criminals faced justice in domestic tribunals, convened across Asia and the Pacific. Allied nations established courts throughout the former Japanese Empire, from the Philippines to Singapore, from China to the Dutch East Indies. These regional tribunals concluded their work by 1949, having processed the cases of lower-ranking officers and enlisted men who had committed atrocities against prisoners of war and civilians. Over 50 Japanese war criminals were executed at Sugamo prison alone. Beyond the 7 high-ranking officials from the Tokyo Tribunal, the executions were carried out methodically, with new gallows constructed specifically for the purpose. The prison became synonymous with the final reckoning for Japan's wartime crimes, its walls witnessing the end of hundreds of military careers that had been built on brutality and conquest. Many of those sentenced to life imprisonment in the Tokyo trials did not live to see freedom. Some died in prison from illness and old age, while others were eventually paroled between 1954 and 1956 as Cold War dynamics shifted American priorities. The changing geopolitical landscape meant that former enemies became valuable allies against the Soviet Union, leading to a more lenient approach toward surviving war criminals. The legacy of incomplete justice. The post-war reckoning with Japanese war criminals was ultimately incomplete and morally compromised. While prominent leaders like Tojo Yamashita and Hama faced execution for their crimes, the most systematic war criminals, those involved in biological and chemical warfare, escaped justice through American immunity deals. Emperor Hirohito, who bore ultimate responsibility as the sovereign in whose name all these crimes were committed, never faced trial and continued to reign until his death in 1989 to the brutal end of Japanese leaders after World War II thus presents a complex moral landscape where justice was selectively applied based on political expediency rather than legal principle. The executions at Sugamo prison provided some measure of retribution for Japan's victims, but the immunity granted to Unit 731 and the Emperor's escape from prosecution represent enduring stains on the historical record. These compromises would influence international law and diplomacy for decades, establishing precedents where strategic interests could override demands for complete justice.